Thank you very much, Danica. We're thrilled to be here. As Danica said, this is the first UX bootcamp for VMS during the IAP period. I'm Karen Donahue.
And I'm Craig Newell.
And we're going to cover these topics tonight. We're going to talk about a problem statement, how to develop one. We're going to talk about personas so that you can build knowledge about your end users of the product that you want to build. We're going to talk about journey mapping, user research, and we'll do Q&A at the end. As Danica mentioned, you can add your questions into the chat. We're going to move very quickly. We have a lot of material to cover tonight, and we're very excited to be here. Our motivation for this workshop, it's really to de-risk and optimize product market fit for an initial release of a new product. We want to teach you about that and talk to you about that tonight. And to do this, we're going to introduce a concept of user-centered design, which is an established methodology, and we're going to apply it to the product development life cycle. So you can see here, this is the overall product development life cycle. And we're going to focus on planning and validation. So the things in the orange circles. We're going to give you a practical framework for designing products that fulfill end users' needs. But you can see just these two parts are part of a much broader product development life cycle. So problem statements, personas, journey maps, they are all part of the planning phase. And the user research is part of the validation. So that's what we're going to cover. And there are lots of other areas which are not part of our talk tonight, but we'll sort of refer to them as we go along. So what do? We ship products. Craig and I have designed, built, and shipped many products, and we've been doing it for many years. These are just a few of the companies we've helped. Some of them are very big companies, some of them are very small companies. We've done a lot of MVPs. I designed the MVP for Resilient Systems, which was acquired by IBM Security. So those are examples of those kinds of MVPs. Craig actually co-founded Savage, which was acquired. It was a mobile device platform, but you can see some of the companies we've worked with and helped. So what is user experience? Sometimes you hear it called UX. It's really a balance between interests. When I say that, I mean a balance between the business needs, users' needs, and the technology constraints. So all of these elements are all part of what defines user experience. And it's really about envisioning a product from the point of view of the end user or perhaps the buyer, really understanding that lens. User-centered design, or sometimes you hear it called design thinking. It's about designing new products or improving existing ones from the point of view of the end user. And it's really about the intersection of those things. User experience is at the intersection of these three areas. And we've seen a lot of very interesting business requirements. We've seen the pace of the business change. We've seen users' requirements change. We certainly dealt with things like scaling and growth, and certainly technology constraints. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the problem statement. When you're starting to design a new product, you really want to be able to articulate what problem does your product solve, for whom, and why is it important? What's the problem? So you can end up in problems if you mistarget the market. This is why problem statement definition is important. You can end up with a product that has a target market that's misunderstood, or you can create a solution to a non-problem. And this is an example of the Juicero device. And I would suggest that you could Google and see about the history of that. That's an example where that you had a design solution product launched for something that was not a problem. So what's the value of a well-written product statement? It's really clearly identifying the problem you're solving and not the solution. So we see a lot of solutions in problem statements, and that's incorrect. You should really be able to communicate the desired vision, the condition that you want the product to be able to address. And it's really useful to communicate this to your team and other stakeholders. So if you really state the problem clearly and you're ready to then work on the solution, the problem statement is a very useful device for all stakeholders and team members. So the format of a problem statement usually goes user, or we call that persona, needs some statement of need, which we usually think of as a verb, because of some compelling reason. That's the general syntax. Now you want to also explain why your product is important. So we're going to talk tonight as a case study example of an iPhone application that Craig and I have developed. We've launched it a few years ago. It's available for free on the App Store, and it's called Local Haze. And what it does is it monitors just under 30,000 air quality sensors over 6 continents. And what it is an application that lets consumers easily understand their local air quality on the go, anywhere they travel to. Why is this important? It's important because if you look at particulate matter, and here's an example from the EPA's website. Particulate matter is very, very tiny particles. And if they are too small, like if they're smaller than 2.5 micrometers, they can get really, really deep into your lungs and cause health issues. So this is an example where you can see in the red circle, there are 4 PM2.5 molecules, PM2.5 particles, and 20 of them will fit in the width of human hair, very tiny. And the more tiny they are, the lower into the lungs they can travel, and it's a health risk. So this is the problem. So we're going to state the problem statement that we're going to address with our product, which is the solution. The problem statement is consumers need to be able to easily monitor the level of local air PM2.5 because it poses a health risk. It follows that syntax that I'm showing on the lower left-hand side, and it states the problem. Now, our problem statement should feed into a use case. A use case describes the user solving the problem. So for example, in our use case with the local haze example, we're solving the use case where the user is asking, is the outdoor air quality okay for me to walk outside? And our solution, which is our product, solves that use case. So you can sort of see the cascading path of where you go from a problem statement to the use case to the solution. The solution is the product, which is an app for consumers to easily understand air quality on the go. A poor problem statement does not do what we just stated. So here's an example of a poorly written product statement. Everyone needs an app to see face icons that use color to represent poor air quality. And the data is read by sensors being monitored worldwide. Why is this a poor problem statement? Well, the persona is not targeted tightly enough. Everyone is too broad. Okay, and you're actually stating the solution in the problem statement. So it's actually describing the solution and not the problem. And there's also no compelling reason why this is important. We want to use that as part of our problem statement. Okay, so again, consumers need to be able to easily monitor the level of local air PM2.5 because of the health risk. The health risk is the impact. So the tips we recommend, we really recommend that you really clearly understand the problem you're solving and for whom before you actually start drafting your problem statement, and don't include the solution. You'll hear me say that over and over. You want to include the value, why it's important, and that your product should enable or optimize the solution to a particular use case. And the format, as we stated, is for that persona, the need, and the compelling reason. Now, once you've written down your problem statement, we want to start thinking about who's the end user of your product. This is really critical in planning and starting to design your solution. We use the term persona to describe who the end user is of the product. We can also have a buyer persona. We'll talk about that later, but we're thinking about the end user and their perspective, their needs, their pain points. And for local haze, we state that our target users are consumers that are also technical citizen scientists. That's our clearly defined persona. Those are our end users. And we're very, very clear on that and intentional. And when we define personas, we really are very rigorous to define what are the frustrations, the pain points, motivations, goals. We really try to understand all the different attributes that make that particular persona unique, so that we can understand how to design a solution. We look at demographics, we look at their affiliations. When we really, really come up with first a hypothesis about the persona, And then we go out and we validate that persona hypothesis by doing interviews. And this is a template. You can get a free copy on our website, and it's just an idea to give you some of the dimensions that we use when we try to fill in. This is what a completed persona would look like, or it could even look like a draft persona that you then go out and validate through interviews. But you really want to understand, like in the case of Local Haze, we felt that it was really important to address frustrations around local air quality and the inability to find DIY sensors to buy, and that people had family members with asthma and they wanted a really great on-the-go solution that was simple to use. So you can see we really put a lot of effort into understanding who the user is and how to define the persona. A persona is an end user model, which means it's really a hypothesis. So it's not proven until you go out and you talk to people. So the way you do validation is you conduct user research, going out and talking to target users. Here's examples of me interviewing users, one in South Station and one in the lobby of a bank in downtown Boston, because you're trying to prove or disprove your hypotheses. Now we're going to talk about journey mapping, which is another thing you can do now to help define your user experience. And what it is a visual timeline of the product's experience from the point of view of a single persona. It's important to think of it as a single persona experience. So we thought about the product journey for Local Haze, and we look at how the user achieves value. And it is through a journey that takes the user through these phases. There's discovery, initial use, where the user is going to actually encounter the product. In this case, it's the iPhone App Store. They might engage with it, they download it, they use it for the first time. They use certain features, and they begin to master the product, and then they hopefully evangelize. So you can see the end-to-end set of phases in the product journey. But we're always asking ourselves, how does the user achieve value, and how does the journey enable that? So this is an example of a journey map. I would encourage you to start sketching them out for your products that you're planning. See, at the top, you've got the phases, and now we've got the different activities or touch points that are part of the journey. So I'm going to walk through and show you the use case. So you want to have a particular use case for a journey. You want the journey to reflect a particular use case for one persona, and you want your journey to be addressing that particular use case. I call them phases. These are those big sort of topics that are defining the different phases of the journey. I think of it also as the state of mind. The user is discovering your product, they're in the state of discovery. They're starting to use it, they're in the state of initial use. They're starting to engage, they're engaging. So those are the ways that I think about the phases. So you want to map that out, and then you want to also look at the channel. So Local Haze is a mobile app. It's only available on iPhone, so it's a single channel user experience. But you might be working on a product that's an enterprise app, or you might be working on other kinds of devices, and you may be crossing multiple channels. So you have to keep in mind that the journey map has to reflect the channels that your product uses. So it's any platform environment where the user uses your product, and they can include web or email or other kinds of channels. The touch points are the actual interactions that the user takes with the system as they actually go through the journey. So in the case of Local Haze, they go to the App Store, they look at the App Store marketing material, they decide whether they're going to download the app, they launch it for the first time, they do what's called onboarding, which is a welcome part of the experience. The first time they get welcomed, they get shown the features. So you can see this is all part of the journey, encouraging the user to make progress through the journey, through the phases. Excuse me. These touch points are really critical, and they could involve more complex flows in each of them. So we're just going to talk about the journey level discussion now, but the touch points are really important. And also, you want to keep in mind the metrics. These are the measurements of success of the journey. So they can be business metrics, they can be KPIs or key performance indicators or any other business outcome. And they can also be user experience metrics like, engagement metrics. But you want to track those and understand what they should be to show that your journey is actually successfully satisfying your use case. So you can see for local haze, for example, we are looking at the number of referrals in the discovery phase, the number of downloads in the initial use where the user is actually on the App Store, the percentage of onboarding completed. These are all metrics that are really critical and roll up into a business outcome. The touch points that fail early in the journey will affect your downstream metrics. So you really have to pay attention to those touch points. So for example, in the App Store, if the App Store copy is poorly written, that's an example. That's a part of the user experience. It's a touch point that it should be selling the download of the app, but if it fails, you can see what happens. There's no downstream metrics because the user has never actually downloaded your product and they don't even get to onboard. So you're halting the journey. So I want you to think hard about what are the touch points in your product's journey and where are the touch points perhaps having issues or causing problems for the user to actually progress well through your journey. These poorly designed or missing touch points can really damage the user's progress and can cause your product to fail. So we think journey mapping can help identify missing steps in the user experience, and that's why we recommend documenting the end-to-end product journey for each persona. Do it for one persona at a time across all relevant channels. And if you think about it, if you're doing a SaaS product, a software as a service, you're going to have other channels and things like email. Email will be one of the channels in your user experience. A lot of teams, sometimes I talk to them, I don't think they realize to what extent email plays a role as a channel in their user experience and it's part of the journey. We've seen examples where startups have failed to notice or failed to recognize that email is part of the journey. And so we've had to really work with teams to make sure that that journey is as smooth as possible to get users through, complete the journey correctly. We look for gaps or interactions, and we're looking for anything that's slowing or halting the user's progress. We want that journey to be really, really great, easy to use, and really propel the user through successfully. Journey mapping can also help you to prioritize what touch points in your journey you need to understand, and you need to understand how they affect your success metrics. So we see issues in authentication, we see issues in onboarding, also first use, the very first time you use a product. So these are all touch points that can have huge effect on your journey. So we recently added a new subscription feature in December. We launched it in December. And it was pretty challenging, had a lot of technical challenges. What it does is you can subscribe to it, a particular air quality sensor anywhere in the world. And that sensor, when the air quality significantly changes, it will send a notification to the phone. Now, what happened was that meant we had to change our journey. So you can see here, we added a subscription section, which is now part of the journey. We did not have that in our initial release, in our MVP, in our early stage release. We added subscription. And now what happens is it changes the journey a bit, but it also changes the metrics. So you can see that our user experience metrics have changed. So now we are looking at monetization metrics. So for example, number of purchases, subscription metrics, or any other ARR, annual revenue, annual recurring revenue. So we want to be able to think about the journey now in terms of that monetization, but we had to add that to the journey. We had to adapt our journey. So we think about it as the user's path to value. So that subscription feature changes the journey and the user's path to value. And we had to really consider that and be intentional about that when we launched that feature. We were very careful. We launched a beta release and we got feedback and we made some adjustments and then we did a final release. But really what we were doing was we were monetizing the journey by adding the subscription. And you may do that too as you roll out features in your product and you work through your product roadmap. So there's new features, there's new metrics. Again, the subscription metrics, those are all things. Churn, for example, that's an example of a metric now we have to watch. So those are all new, and that's affected by the new journey design. So our best practices tips for journey mapping is to use one persona and one scenario use case for a journey map. We've seen situations where teams or in early stage teams will try to conflate many different personas into one journey map. We don't recommend that. It gets too complicated and unclear. And we also think you should be defining the end-to-end. So think end-to-end as a narrative, as a journey, and track all the phases, channels, and touch points. And use the metrics, whatever metrics that you think are appropriate for your business and your user experience. So we're going to talk now about validation, which is looking at some of the assumptions. Remember we said personas, it's a hypothesis, right? So we want to validate some of those hypotheses about our personas, and also maybe we want to validate the steps in our journey map. So this is an example of user research. We're going to actually do a practice session or a real user experience research session here. Craig is going to play Alex, who's our user interviewee, and we're going to show you what that will look like. Okay, so you want to validate the assumptions with potential target users. That means gathering any evidence to validate your assumptions, but you also could be validating your problem statement. You could be validating your personas, or you could actually be validating your journeys by asking users, what they would expect to go through as a process. You can use the findings from your user research to drive prioritization of features. You can make sure that the features are not missed. So sometimes journey maps can help with this, because you'll look at the journey map and say, oh, you know what, we forgot to add that feature. Or one of the most common ones we see is onboarding is somehow forgotten. So journey mapping can help you with that. So the basic steps of user research, if you don't know them already, is planning. So deciding who you're going to interview and what data you want to gather, and any hypotheses you want to test, and organize the logistics and the recruiting for the interviews. We usually recommend recruiting a bit more, maybe a few more people, because people will cancel. But once you've got your interviews set up, you're going to do your target user interviews. You're going to complete those interviews with the target users and observe their reactions and gather feedback. And then you're going to do analysis and reporting. And you're going to analyze the data that you gather in the interviews and report the results to any stakeholders that will incorporate these updates into the next phase of product development. So we're going to do an example user research session. It's for a new product concept. So we're going to validate a new concept for a wearable fitness tracker. Our test bed, which is the environment that we're going to use for testing, we're just going to actually use talking about it today. We don't actually have a prototype, but you could use concept designs or sketches or mock-ups or a working prototype, whatever you want to actually gather data about. Remember our problem statement definition. We said we want it to be very clear as to what this problem is. So our problem statement here is fitness enthusiasts need an easy way to monitor activity to manage and maintain good health. That's our problem statement. And our hypothesis is that we think that we want to interview fitness enthusiasts to find out that they want to track their fitness progress on the go. In other words, in a mobile experience. So what we do is we would recruit target users to give you useful feedback. We recommend not wasting your effort recruiting or interviewing people who are the wrong target users. That's not going to give you really useful data. You should write out a script for your interview and really be clear, it's not a selling exercise. This is not about selling, this is about gathering and listening and getting information. So you want to gather that data and then use it to prove or disprove your hypotheses. And we recommend that you do a pilot test and then you adjust your testing environment. Write down your hypotheses. So remember, you got that hypothesis, so you always have that clear in your mind when you're doing your research. This is our persona hypothesis. So we fill out our persona template with some hypotheses. We think that this user is kind of concerned about battery life and he's a skier. We're interviewing fitness enthusiasts. This particular person we're going to interview is a skier. And we think that they want to be able to use it to compete in downhill ski races, but that they also want to change the color of the strap. We're making these sort of guesses about what this persona's needs are and their pain points and their interests and what they want in the product. So the first tip is we want to ask open-ended questions. So we're going to we'll first ask some demographic questions, and I think I skipped a slide. But the questions should be really open-ended. And so we might ask him a question like, we welcome him, welcome Alex, thank you for joining us. And this is not a sales session, so we just want to get your feedback. How did you decide to wear this tracker that you use currently?
I decided to wear it because I really want to be able to quantify what I do, my activity levels during the day, not just have this thing of, oh, did I exercise or not, but actually know that did I exercise hard or just a little bit? Was it many times in the day, or did I just do all of my exercise in one time in the day?
And what are your goals in using the tracker?
My goals in the tracker is to be able to consistently quantify my amount of activity that I do so that I'm prepared for the winter season coming up.
Okay, so just letting you know, did you hear that when I asked him the questions, I didn't ask leading questions. I have open-ended questions, and I do not talk over him. Okay, I'm not trying to sell anything to him, and I am not trying to influence him. So that's something we see. You know, founders are often very excited about their product, so they try to talk over the interviewer. That's not what you want to do. You want to ask the question, listen, and listen to the answer. So we want to dig in for issues and perceptions. We had a slide in here that was about demographics, which you should do first, which is get some basic demographic information, but then start asking these questions. So, you know, how long have you been wearing the fitness tracker? How often do you use it? When do you use it? Can you walk me through an example of a day in the life of how you would use it? Those kinds of questions. Okay. What do you like about using the tracker?
Well, I like it to be able to actually quantify what I do. I don't have to sort of guess that, oh, did I do 10 minutes in the morning or did I do 15 minutes in the morning? I have this record that says that I'm doing it either consistently or maybe not so consistently, depending upon the weather or the week.
Do you have any problems with the tracker?
The tracker works pretty well at tracking activity, but it has a few interesting sort of little quirks that you have. For example, it only tracks one day at a time. So at midnight, it loses all of everything that you've done for the day, and it sort of starts out fresh again. So if you happen to not remember to check it just before midnight, you just sort of look at your watch and it says, oh, I didn't do anything. That's a bit of a pain because then I have to go back and go and find the computer and make sure that it's synced up, and then I can actually start to see the history that I have. And then the other concern that I have is just keeping it alive. It's, you know, I'm pretty good at being able to charge it every night. So it's the fact that it doesn't last a huge long time isn't really a problem, but it would be really nice if I forgot to charge it one day, it would survive the next day. And because it just sort of gets 1 3/4 days, it would be really nice if it just made it through the second day.
Okay, so did you hear how he answered the questions and then he started talking about the problems, and I'm letting him talk. I might also use some prompts like say, to get him to keep talking. So he's talking about the problems with the current tracker and what he would want in an ideal tracker. So that's important for you to be listening as a researcher so that you can be using this to help validate your persona and also think about how you're going to design your solution. And then usually when we're doing the closing, we will ask them, you know, can we contact you in the future if we have a prototype? And we thank them for their time. We tell them how much we appreciate their inputs. I usually write them a very nice email, and if appropriate, you can give them a gift card or something to show them how much you appreciate their time. So that's kind of the overall end-to-end flow for doing a user research session. And what do you do when you get the data is you now go back to your assumptions. So we had some incorrect assumptions, right? We assumed that he wanted to be able to swap out the color of the band. It turns out that wasn't something. He was more interested in being able to track trends on the device. And he was really concerned about battery life. So those are features now that, you know, as you're thinking about how you're going to design your solution, they should be prioritized because those are the things that you're hearing. And then once you've done that interview, you would go out and do, maybe you'd start with 5, 6, 7, 8 interviews. And over time, you're going to be building up evidence to validate your assumptions. You might be disproving them as well, right? So you want to validate the core assumptions about personas. You want to look for the trends across all of your interviews. And we think about it as signal. Like we say, well, we stop when we get a consistency of signal. Once we start hearing the same thing over and 6 to maybe 4, 5, 6 times, we know that the signal we're getting is consistent. And what we're looking is to create really validated personas that are really unique and not overlapping. When you're overlapping personas too much, you end up with solutions that can be very kind of targeted incorrectly, or they're clouded. So you end up with solutions where you're not clearly defining the solution based on a particular persona's needs. And keep in mind, your personas can be a buyer, that is the person making the decision, the go, no go purchase decision about your product, or they can be end user. And if you have enterprise application or a more complex buyer end user scenario, then that those are going to require separate journey maps and perhaps separate user experiences. We've done, like you say, we've done a series of interviews. We end up with multiple personas, and there are similarities, but there are actually really different requirements. So, the legibility, for example, might be consistent, but they might have very, very different needs based on perhaps where they are in their fitness journey, excuse me, their age or their particular interest. So you can see that for our interviewee, Alex, he's a consumer fitness enthusiast who is interested in competing in downhill racing, but we might have a fitness recovery user who's over 75, who's recovering from knee replacement surgery and has a very different set of needs. So you can see that the personas begin to show up when we have conducted interviews and gathered that data. So what not to do in research interviews: do not ask leading questions. So you don't want to bias your interviewees. Don't interrupt them, don't talk over them, don't try to sell them anything. Just get the data by listening to them. You can write it down. I usually find that not typing is a good way to keep the conversation going and not be disruptive. This is a great thing for an intern, if you have an intern, to have them actually writing down or recording the data as well. And you want to keep these early interviews qualitative. Quantitative research can come later, but you're trying to get qualitative data about your personas and validate your journeys and make sure that you're designing the right solution. If you don't understand your target personas, you're going to add risk. We think of it as risk of mistargeting the product's experience. And for example, not making the battery last long enough without charging. If we hadn't talked to him and gotten him to explain what his concerns were, we might have missed that. That turns out to be a really critical feature. Not understanding the unique journey for each persona. So we see situations where teams will conflate the buyer persona and end user persona. And in most cases, these are two different personas. They shouldn't be conflated. Conflating them can complicate really important parts of the journey. Remember, it's about the user's path to value. And the buyer persona might be just doing an assessment to set up a proof of concept and making a purchase, no purchase decision, whereas the end user would have very, very different needs. And so we've seen examples where conflated personas have lengthened sales cycles, for example. So you don't want to do that. Okay, so we're going to give a little bit of a recap. So what we talked about earlier on when we said the motivation for this workshop was to de-risk and optimize product market fit so that your initial release of a product is successful and it hits the target and it satisfies the customer.
You can also think of this very much as, did we define the minimum viable product correctly? Because it's often that if you're not actually going out and thinking hard about what you're adding, you'll end up adding way too much into what you think is the minimum viable product. Or on the other hand, it's very easy to leave out 1 or 2 steps in the whole process and end up with a minimum viable product that's just not there. Maybe it does one of the particular personas, but it doesn't quite meet the other persona that's meant in it. And obviously things like onboarding and things are very easy for people to skip over at the beginning. But if you skip over it, it's then very hard to get those first users on board without having to handhold people through the process.
So the recap, what did we talk about? Okay, we talked about understanding the problem and defining the problem statement. So that's really the what and the why. Clearly articulating the problem statement, don't include the solution. Your product enables or solves a solution to a use case. So think of it that way. We give you a format. There are probably others you can look up, but we think that's a nice simple format.
Yeah, you have to be very careful to not be in the thing of if I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if you want to go and really think very, very hard about, okay, how are the end user getting value from it? And then you can go and say, okay, maybe there's other ways to be able to get that value rather than just the solution that came to mind. Doing the other way around, which is that you have a solution looking for a problem, that's a very risky place to be in often cases, because it's very hard to find product market fit quickly, rather than going it the other way and saying, okay, what's the value that my end user needs? Okay, I can then go up and through the solution space to find a solution for it.
Okay, so on personas, we talked about validating the persona, which is the user of your solution. We want you to think about first develop a proposal for the persona, okay? Then go out and validate your assumptions, and then update your persona proposal and make sure that you've got a really solid validated persona, and that you've been able to distinguish between multiple personas. I'd say one of the biggest challenges I see is teams will often say, well, we have 14 personas, and we say, no, we probably have fewer than that. Let's take a look, and now let's really figure out and dig in, like, what are the core personas that are really unique.
But on the other hand, you have to realize that you normally have more than one persona. Even for something as simple as the fitness band, you obviously have the main persona, which is the end user that's wearing the fitness band and using it. But you will then have quite often another important person, which is the person that buys that as a Christmas present. And therefore, they'll have a very different way of being able to look at it and evaluate the product and what value they're going to get for it than the actual end user that's using the product.
I mean, let's say that you want to launch this fitness product as an enterprise product. Well, that would end up, you'd have an end user who might be an employee who wants to improve their fitness. You might have someone maybe in IT, somebody who has got to administer the deployment of the solution across the enterprise. And you might have a buyer persona who's a business person who needs to come up with a reason or, a return on investment in deploying the solution. So that's a much more complicated example where you'd have three personas, very, very distinct needs, and then very different journeys. And the product user experience might be different for each of them.
So enterprise is a great way of ending up with multiple different personas, and they all have their journeys. And in a lot of cases, you have to realize that maybe not a single user experience is going to be able to meet all of these. So in an enterprise case, you'll quite often have one user experience that the user sees, which is very, very different than that the admin sees for the exact same product.
Or the buyer, if the buyer is a business executive who needs to make a decision. So we recommend that you document the personas, and you can use them, the documentation, to prioritize them, because you may have a primary target persona, and then you have, secondary and maybe lower priority, but use the personas in a sort of prioritized way and start with your most targeted persona, the highest priority. And, we like to share the personas with the team, and we like to keep them updated because personas can change over time. Your target market can change, your product can change, your users' needs can change. And so anytime you're going to do a major release, we think it's important to go back and validate the personas and make sure that your target users' needs are still the same as on which you have based your assumptions for that particular release.
Yeah, and sometimes, especially when you're doing a second release for a product, then it's very easy to then go back and say, okay, let me look at my sales motion. Where am I actually selling? Where am I not selling? And then you can make a decision as to should the personas match the current personas, or am I actually wanting to target it for some slightly different persona? And therefore I need to adjust my product in my next release to more target that, rather than the persona which I managed to have captured. Maybe my product captured a whole pile of free users, and it hasn't done very well at capturing the persona of someone who's going to pay for it, subscribe for the particular solution.
With regard to sales motion and personas, it would be great if you could take a look at Kent Summers' workshop that he did earlier in the week during IAP. He's a MIT VMS mentor, and his workshop on sales bootcamp is really excellent. And I took it earlier this week. It's the second time I've taken it. I took it on campus in 2014, and there's really useful information in there. And it's related to this idea of knowing your personas and how to actually create the right personas to offer your product and enable your sales motion. Okay, so journey mapping. What you're thinking about is the end-to-end for each persona. So right there is the example of our initial journey phases for local haze before we added the subscription feature. You want to validate the journeys with target personas, and you're going to look for gaps that are slowing or damaging or halting the user's progress. You want the user to get through from the beginning to the end smoothly in a streamlined way without any points of friction. We recently did an MVP project where there were lots of problems in the MVP journey, and we had to really work hard to analyze them and fix them.
Yeah, and it's really important to not just focus necessarily on your product, but where it overall sits towards getting the value. This might be as simple as in a consumer application where you just rush through the app store. Oh, I just want to publish it. I want to get it up there very quickly. But remember that first impression of what your product is on the app store there. So it's really worthwhile spending extra time. Or I could be, on the other hand, I could be on an enterprise app, and you go through and you rush through and you build your app and you get it shipped off, but you forgot to create the training documentation and everything that you're going to give the customer so that they can onboard their employees into your application without a lot of effort and time on their part. Whereas if you've just done that little bit of work and said, okay, I need to create both the application and the training information to go along with it, you end up with that whole process of getting the end user to value smoothly all the way through.
So as we noted earlier, we recommend that you prioritize the important touch points and understand the impact on your metrics, whatever they may be. They might be the business metrics or user experience metrics. When we do a recap of the research, we did a little mini user research session. We want you to validate your assumptions through these interviews, validate the personas and the journeys. You use the target users. You can do a pilot on someone who may not be quite the target, just to kind of work the kinks out of your interview process. But you want to ask open-ended questions, no selling. Use the results to share with the development team. It's really great evidence to be able to show your development team, look, people really want this, or they prioritize this feature, or they can't figure out how to do this.
We should remember that at this stage here, we're all about validation of the problem. And it's not the same thing as when we're actually evaluating how a user is using the product. So in this case, it's really important not to bias the user necessarily with, oh, you have a particular solution to a problem. That's a separate set of interviews and everything else that you do from once you've actually designed and created the product. Whereas here, we're just really looking and trying to make sure, do we have the right idea of what the value is? Do we know how they're going to get to the value and everything else? And trying not to even mention what your solution is all the way through the whole exercise.
We're doing this to confirm assumptions before committing to a major release, because that's a really expensive thing in terms of resources. So we're basically de-risking this process. We're trying to, be able to confidently say, this is a solution. These are the requirements. These are the problems that we're solving, and you have a clear idea on how to design the solution before you actually commit resources to build. So we showed you some examples of activities in the planning and validation stage. This is only one small part of a much broader life cycle. So in the detailing, for example, you'd be working on very detailed UX flows, interaction models that happen in your application or your product, screen wireframes that are the details. There's all kinds of things that go into the UX spec, which is what engineering will work from. So visual design, any other kinds of specifications, language, considerations for people with special needs, etc. And then you actually get to a build working prototype, and then you might do a soft launch, and then it sort of the cycle starts over again. So this is only one part of the overall process. We want you to understand that.
But you have to remember that it's very important, because if you look at something like a user experience flow where I've mapped out all of the different screens and how I transfer from one screen to another as in my application, you can really have to think about that as, I've taken the journey maps from each of my personas and I've sort of unioned them together. I've overlaid them together. And that's how you should be able to be thinking about the user flows. So rather than just saying, okay, I have this solution, I'm going to design a UI because I think I have to edit it, I think I have to be able to print it, I have to be able to view it. No, you should go back and say, really, the users are getting in this particular flow, this is the value, and I want to have my UI lead the users through it, rather than necessarily just toss them into a Microsoft Word and say, go for it, when they're not really given, okay, this is what you do, this is what you'll do next, this is what you do through the application. So it's really important to get these resources done, and they're not just something that should end up in a PRD document and then forgotten about as you go on to actually build the application further on in the development phase. I think the other thing to remember is that this second half of the process where you're detailing it is these days becoming very much of a patterned environment. So whereas a long time ago, you'd be starting from scratch, today, when you go to build an application and you pick either a mobile platform or even just picking a web platform, your basic web framework, pick on something such as Material, provides just so much of the basic framework of how things should go together and on the screen, that once you've got to UX flows, the rest of the whole detailing process is almost just a cookie cutter. Okay, I take this particular pattern, I implement it. I take this particular pattern, I implement it. And that goes all the way down even to your final UX specification, where it's no longer a matter of putting colors on things. It's no, I have a theme. I'm just going to, I'll work with marketing to make sure I get the theme. I'll work with usability to make sure I have the contrast and so on in the theme. And at that point, it's just apply the theme to the implementation, and it's not a final thing. So a lot of this sort of phase of it is becoming very cookie cutter as you go through the process. And it's really important to spend that time and effort up front, making sure that you really know what you're doing, because otherwise you're just going to be going through this whole process and looping a number of times before you can get that product market fit.